Hey there, friend. Tonight, we're going somewhere extraordinary. Imagine a city built on a mountain ridge so high that clouds drift through its plazas. A place where massive stones fit together so perfectly that you can't slide a knife blade between them. A civilization that built the longest road system in the world without ever inventing the wheel. This is the story of the Inca Empire and the mysterious cloud city of Machu Picchu. How did they do it? How did a people with no written language, no iron tools, and no wheeled vehicles build one of the most sophisticated empires the world has ever seen? Tonight, we're going back 500 years, before the Spanish arrived, before the tourists came, to discover the secrets of a civilization that seemed impossible by every measure, yet thrived for over a century in some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. Before we begin, if you enjoy this kind of journey into the past, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a wonderful way to support the channel, and it truly means the world to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. Drop a comment and let me know. Now, get comfortable. Dim the lights if you can. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. And let's travel together back to a time of mountain gods, golden temples, and a lost city hidden in the clouds. Chapter 1. The Children of the Sun. Our story begins not with a grand empire, but with a humble origin. A small tribe huddled in a high valley, surrounded by peaks that scraped the sky. This was the Valley of Cusco, nestled deep in the Andes Mountains of what we now call Peru. The people who would become the Inca had a sacred story about their beginning. It was a tale they told around fires, a legend that explained not just where they came from, but why they were destined to rule. The story goes like this. Long ago, the world was in chaos. Humanity lived in darkness and disorder. The great god Inti, the sun himself, looked down upon the world with sadness. He decided to send his own children to bring civilization to the earth. Their names were Manco Capac and Mama Oclo. They were brother and sister, husband and wife, both divine. Inti gave them a golden staff and a sacred mission. He told them to travel across the land until they found a place where the golden staff would sink into the earth with a single thrust. There, in that blessed spot, they were to found a great city and teach the people how to live in harmony with the gods. Manco Capac and Mama Oclo emerged from the depths of Lake Titicaca, the highest navigable lake in the world. They walked north through the mountains, testing the earth at every stop. Finally, in the fertile valley of Cusco, the golden staff plunged deep into the soil. This was the sign. This was home. The city they founded became Cusco, which means the navel of the world in their language, Quechua. It would become the heart of an empire that the Inca called Tawantinsuyu. This name is beautiful and precise. It means the four parts together. The empire was divided into four great regions, all radiating out from the sacred center of Cusco, like the cardinal directions from a compass. Now, here's what makes this story even more remarkable. When the Inca began their rise to power, they were just one small tribe among many in the Andes. The year was around 1300 AD, roughly the same time that Venice was at the height of its power on the other side of the world. But while Venice took 1,000 years to build its empire, the Inca would build theirs in less than 100. Let me put this in perspective for you. If you're listening from the United States, imagine building a nation that stretched from New York City all the way down to the tip of Florida, then west to Arizona, and included mountains higher than anything in North America, coastal deserts, and tropical jungles. Now imagine doing all of this in the time between the American Revolution and the Civil War. That's the speed at which the Inca built their world. The true explosion of Inca power began with a leader named Pachacuti. His name means earth-shaker, or he who remakes the world, and he earned it. Pachacuti became the 9th Super Inca, which means the only Inca, the supreme ruler, around 1438. He was not born to rule. He was a younger son. But when a powerful neighboring tribe attacked Cusco, his father and older brother fled in fear. Pachacuti stayed. He rallied the defenders. Against impossible odds, he drove the invaders back. Legend says that even the stones of the battlefield rose up to fight as warriors on his side. This miraculous victory gave him the authority and prestige to take the throne, and with it, he began a transformation. Under Pachacuti, they became conquerors. They became builders. They became the children of the sun in truth, spreading their light across the Andes. Pachacuti didn't just expand territory. He rebuilt Cusco itself, transforming it from a modest town into a magnificent imperial capital. He created the systems of roads, the administrative structures, and the religious ceremonies that would define the empire for generations. But here's what's truly fascinating about the Inca. They achieved all of this without some of the tools we think of as essential to civilization. They had no written language, no alphabet, no books, no written laws or histories. Everything was passed down through memory, through songs, through carefully trained oral historians called amautas. Instead of writing, they had something called quipus. These were complex arrangements of coloured strings with knots tied at specific intervals. A quipu keeper could record everything from tax payments to census data to historical events, all encoded in the type of knot, the colour of the string, and the position along the cord. To this day, scholars are still trying to fully decode the information stored in surviving quipus. It was a completely different way of organising information, and it worked. The Inca also had no iron. They worked with bronze, gold, and silver, but they never developed iron tools or weapons. Their buildings were constructed with stone tools, wooden wedges, and an incredible understanding of engineering and physics that still baffles modern architects. And perhaps most surprisingly, they had no wheeled vehicles. Not because they didn't understand the concept of the wheel. They had wheeled toys for children. But in the steep mountain terrain where they lived, wheels were simply impractical. Instead, they built the most extensive road network in the pre-Columbian Americas and moved everything by foot, with the help of llamas and human porters. The empire they built stretched for over 2,500 miles along the spine of South America. To put that in modern terms, it covered parts of present-day Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, and Colombia. At its height, the Inca ruled over an estimated 12 million people, made up of hundreds of different ethnic groups, speaking dozens of languages. This vast diversity was both their greatest strength and their greatest challenge. The Inca were master administrators. They didn't simply conquer people and leave them to their own devices. They integrated them into the empire with a sophisticated system that was both remarkably tolerant and ruthlessly efficient. When the Inca conquered a new region, they allowed the local leaders to keep their positions, as long as they swore loyalty to the Sapa Inca and acknowledged Inti, the sun god, as supreme. They allowed people to keep their local gods and customs, but they also required them to learn Quechua, the language of the empire. They built roads to connect the new territory to Cusco, and they established the mita system. The mita was a form of labour tax. Every able-bodied person in the empire owed a certain amount of labour to the state each year. This labour built the roads, the temples, the agricultural terraces, and the great cities. It was the engine that powered everything. And in return, the state provided food security. Massive storehouses called kulkas were built throughout the empire, filled with dried potatoes, corn, quinoa, and other goods. When famine struck a region, the state would open these storehouses and feed the people. This was a civilization built on reciprocity. The Inca word for this concept was aini. It meant mutual obligation, the sacred duty to give and receive. The emperor gave protection and stability. The people gave labour and loyalty. It was a social contract carved in stone and enforced by the will of the sun. But the Inca were not naive idealists. They understood that empires are held together by more than goodwill. They had a policy called mitime, a forced resettlement program. When they conquered a region that was rebellious or strategically important, they would move entire communities of loyal subjects into the area. At the same time, they would relocate the potentially troublesome local population to the heart of the empire, where they could be watched and assimilated. It was a calculated strategy of social engineering designed to prevent uprising and ensure loyalty. The Sapa Inca himself was not just a king. He was considered a living god, the direct descendant of Inti. He wore a crown called the Mascapecha, a woven band with a red fringe that hung over his forehead. No one else in the empire was allowed to wear this. When the Sapa Inca travelled, he was carried on a golden litter by specially chosen bearers. His feet never touched the common ground. Everything he touched, every plate he ate from, every garment he wore, was used only once and then destroyed or stored away. To touch the Sapa Inca without permission was death. And yet, for all this divine status, the Sapa Inca was also expected to be a warrior, an administrator, and a builder. He led armies into battle. He oversaw construction projects. He performed the sacred rituals that ensured the sun would rise and the crops would grow. The weight of the empire rested on his shoulders alone. The Inca believed they were literally the children of the sun. They believed their empire was the center of the world, and their mission was to bring order and civilization to all humanity. This was not arrogance to them. It was sacred duty. And so they built roads that climbed mountains and crossed deserts. They built cities that seemed to grow out of the living rock. They built an empire that, for a brief shining moment, was the largest in the world. But empires, no matter how mighty, are fragile things. The Inca could not have known that their entire world was about to change. That strangers from across an ocean they didn't know existed were already on their way. And that within a single generation, everything they had built would lie in ruins. But that darkness is still far ahead. For now, in this moment, the empire stands at its peak. The sun shines on Cusco. The roads stretch in 4 directions. And somewhere, high in the mountains, hidden in the clouds, a secret city is being built. A place so beautiful, so perfectly hidden, that it will survive the destruction to come. That place is Machu Picchu. But before we can understand Machu Picchu, we must first understand the genius that made it possible. We must understand how the Inca built without mortar, without iron, without wheels, and created structures that have stood for 500 years, surviving earthquakes that destroyed Spanish colonial buildings built on top of them. We must understand the genius of stone. Chapter 2. The Genius of Stone. If you've ever seen a photograph of Inca stonework, you know there's something almost unsettling about it. The stones fit together with such perfection that it seems impossible. Not difficult. Impossible. There are walls in Cusco where massive blocks of stone, some weighing over 100 tons, are fitted together so precisely that you cannot slide a piece of paper between them. Not a knife blade. Not even a piece of paper. 500 years later, after countless earthquakes, after centuries of rain and sun and human touch, the stones still hold together without a single drop of mortar. How did they do it? This question has obsessed archaeologists, engineers, and visitors for generations. The Spanish conquistadors who first saw these walls were convinced they must have been built by demons or giants. They couldn't imagine how mere humans, especially humans without iron tools, could achieve such perfection. Let's start with the stones themselves. The Inca quarried their stone from mountainsides, often miles away from the building site. They preferred specific types of rock. Granite was a favourite for its hardness and durability. Andesite, a volcanic rock, was another. These are not soft stones. They're incredibly dense and difficult to work with, even with modern steel tools. The Inca had bronze chisels and stone hammers. That's it. No iron, no steel. And yet they could shape these massive blocks with a precision that seems to require lasers and computer guidance. Here's what we think we know about their technique. The Inca masons would use harder stones to pound and chip away at softer areas of the rock. It was a process of patient, methodical erosion. They would create a rough shape first, then gradually refine it. But the final fitting, the moment when 2 stones would come together with that impossible precision that required something more. Some researchers believe they used a technique called stone grinding. They would place the 2 stones together and grind them against each other with sand and water as an abrasive. Slowly, painstakingly, the surfaces would conform to each other. It could take months to fit a single stone. But the Inca had something that modern builders often lack: time, patience, and an entire empire's worth of labour. But there's another mystery that's even deeper. Look closely at Inca walls, and you'll notice something strange. The stones aren't uniform rectangles. They're irregular, polygonal shapes. Some have 5 sides. Some have 6, 8, or even 12. Each stone is unique, carved to fit perfectly with all its neighbours, like pieces of an impossibly complex 3-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. Why would they do this? Why not just cut rectangular blocks, which would be so much easier? The answer is earthquakes. The Andes Mountains are one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. The entire western coast of South America sits on the Ring of Fire, where tectonic plates collide and grind against each other. Earthquakes are not a matter of if, but when. The Inca understood this. Their irregular, interlocking stones create a wall that can flex and move during an earthquake without collapsing. When the ground shakes, the stones shift slightly, absorbing the energy, then settle back into place. It's a brilliant solution to a deadly problem. In Cusco, you can see the evidence of this genius with your own eyes. The Spanish built their colonial buildings directly on top of Inca foundations. When major earthquakes struck in 1750 and again in 1950, the Spanish walls crumbled and fell. The Inca foundations beneath them stood firm. Not a stone moved. Now let's talk about scale. The most impressive example of Inca stonework isn't in Machu Picchu. It's in a fortress complex called Sacsayhuaman, built on a hill overlooking Cusco. Sacsayhuaman is staggering. It's made up of 3 massive terraced walls, zigzagging across the hillside. The largest stones in these walls weigh over 200 tons. That's 400,000 pounds. That's more than 30 full-size elephants. And these stones were quarried from a site over 20 miles away, dragged across rivers and up mountains, and fitted into place with that same impossible precision. Think about that for a moment. 200 tons. Without wheels. Without draft animals strong enough to pull such weight. Without cranes or pulleys made of metal. How? The honest answer is that we still don't fully know. But we can make educated guesses based on experimental archaeology and the few Spanish chronicles that describe Inca construction methods. The Inca likely used a combination of techniques. They built earthen ramps to move stones up to higher levels. They used wooden rollers and levers. They had thousands of workers pulling on ropes, made from plant fibers, coordinating their efforts with songs and rhythmic chants. They understood physics intuitively, how to use leverage and counterweights to move massive objects. But there's also evidence that they used something more elegant. They shaped the stones themselves to make them easier to move. Some blocks have small knobs or protrusions left on them, placed precisely where ropes could be looped for pulling. Once the stone was in place, these knobs would be carved away, leaving a smooth surface. They also carved channels and grooves into the stone surfaces during transport, allowing wooden poles to be inserted for leverage and control. Moving a 200-ton stone wasn't about brute force alone. It was about understanding balance, about knowing exactly where to apply pressure to make the impossible merely difficult. At Sacsayhuaman, there's a stone known as the Tired Stone. It's a massive block that sits along the ancient road from the quarry, abandoned partway through its journey. Why did they stop? No one knows. But that stone has become a kind of monument to the immense challenge of what the Inca accomplished. For every stone that made it to its destination, how many others were lost along the way? How many workers died in the effort? The Spanish chronicler Garcilaso de la Vega, who was himself half Inca, wrote about Sacsayhuaman with a mixture of pride and melancholy. He said that 20,000 men worked on it for over 60 years. He described how a massive stone, being moved up a steep slope, broke free from its ropes and rolled backward, crushing 3,000 men beneath it. Whether this number is accurate or exaggerated, we don't know. But it reminds us that these monuments were built with human hands, human sweat, and human blood. The genius of Inca stonework wasn't just technical, it was also deeply spiritual. The Inca believed that stones were alive. They had spirits. They could communicate. The word for a sacred stone was huaca, and huacas were scattered throughout the empire. Some were natural formations that looked like animals or gods. Others were carved or shaped by human hands. When an Inca mason shaped a stone, he wasn't just performing a mechanical task. He was engaging in a sacred dialogue with the living rock. He was bringing out the spirit within. This is why Inca walls have such a sense of organic flow. The stones don't look forced or artificial. They look like they grew into place, like they belong there. There's a famous stone in Cusco called the 12-angled stone. It's part of a wall that once belonged to the palace of Inca Roca, the sixth Sapa Inca. This single stone has 12 precisely cut angles, fitting perfectly with every surrounding stone. It's become a symbol of Inca perfection, photographed by countless tourists. But here's what most visitors don't realize. That stone is part of a wall that has stood for over 600 years. It has survived earthquakes that registered over 7.0 on the Richter scale. It has outlasted empires. And it will likely stand for hundreds of years more, long after our modern steel and concrete buildings have crumbled to dust. The Inca built for eternity. They built with a patience and skill that we, in our age of speed and efficiency, have largely forgotten. Every stone was a prayer. Every wall was a testament. And every building was a conversation between humanity and the sacred mountains that watched over them. This genius, this impossible perfection, reached its highest expression in a place the Spanish would never find. A royal estate hidden so perfectly in the folds of the mountains that it remained lost to the outside world for 400 years. But to understand why someone would build a city in such an inaccessible place, we first need to understand how the Inca connected their empire. We need to understand the roads that made everything possible. Chapter 3. The Royal Road. Imagine you're standing in the Great Plaza of Cusco, the navel of the world, the sacred center of the empire. It's a clear morning in the year 1500, 12 years before the Spanish will arrive. From where you stand, 4 great roads stretch out in the 4 cardinal directions, each one leading to one of the 4 quarters of Tawantinsuyu. These are not simple dirt paths. They are the Kapak Yan, the royal roads, the arteries through which the lifeblood of the empire flows. The Qapak Yan was the longest and most sophisticated road system ever built in the pre-Columbian Americas. When you add up all the routes, side paths, and connecting roads, the network stretched for over 25,000 miles. Some estimates put it as high as 40,000 miles. To put that in perspective, that's longer than the entire interstate highway system of the United States. And the Inca built it in less than a century, through some of the most challenging terrain on the planet. These roads crossed everything. They climbed mountains over 15,000 feet high, where the air is so thin it's hard to breathe. They descended into tropical river valleys where humidity and vegetation fought to reclaim every human footstep. They traversed the driest desert on Earth, the Atacama, where some regions have never recorded a single drop of rain. In the mountains, the roads were often paved with precisely fitted stones, creating staircases that marched up impossible slopes. In the coastal desert, they were marked with wooden posts because there were no stones to build with. In the jungle, they became elevated causeways to stay above the flooding rivers. And connecting it all, spanning the chasms and gorges where rivers had cut deep into the earth, were bridges. The Inca built bridges that were engineering marvels. The most famous were the suspension bridges, woven entirely from grass. These weren't flimsy rope bridges like you might imagine. They were substantial structures, some over 150 feet long, strong enough to support entire military units marching across in formation. The bridges were made from a specific type of grass called Ichu, which grows high in the Andes. Local communities were responsible for maintaining the bridges in their region. Each year, they would gather the grass, twist it into massive cables as thick as a human body, and weave these cables into the bridge structure. The bridge would be anchored on both sides to stone pillars or mountainsides. Walking across one of these bridges must have been a test of nerve. They swayed with every step. The wind howling up from the gorge below would make them dance and bounce. Far beneath, a river would roar over rocks, waiting for anyone who lost their footing. There is one of these bridges still being maintained today, using the exact same traditional methods. It's called the Keswachaka Bridge, and it spans a gorge in the Apurimac River Valley. Every year, the local communities gather in a festival to rebuild the bridge completely. It takes 3 days. It's been done this way for over 500 years, an unbroken tradition connecting the present directly to the Inca past. But the roads and bridges were just infrastructure. What made them truly powerful was the system that used them. The Inca created the fastest communication network in the ancient Americas. It was called the Chasqui system. Chasqui were relay runners. They were young men, selected for their speed and endurance, trained from childhood to run at high altitude. They were stationed at small buildings called tambos, positioned roughly every 4 to 7 miles along the major roads. Here's how it worked. A message needed to travel from Cusco to Quito, the capital of the northern quarter of the empire. That's a distance of about 1,200 miles. A single runner could never cover such a distance quickly, but a relay system could. The first chasqui would leave Cusco at a full sprint, carrying the message. This might be a verbal message, memorized perfectly, or it might be encoded in a quipu. He would run as fast as he could to the next tambo. There, a fresh runner would be waiting, always ready. The message would be transferred in seconds, and the new runner would take off while the first collapsed in exhaustion. This relay would continue, day and night, runners handing off to runners, covering roughly 150 to 240 miles per day. A message could travel from Cusco to Quito in less than a week. To put this in perspective, that's faster than it took news to travel across Europe in the same time period. The Spanish chroniclers were amazed by this system. One conquistador wrote that the Sapa Inca in Cusco could be eating fresh fish from the Pacific Ocean over 200 miles away, caught that same morning. The chasqui would run it up the mountains, packed in ice or wrapped in seaweed, still fresh when it arrived at the royal table. But the chasqui weren't just messengers. They were the intelligence network of the empire. They carried news of rebellions, reports from distant governors, warnings of approaching armies. In a world without writing, without telegraphs or telephones, this human network was the only way to hold such a vast empire together. The tambos, where the chasqui waited, were more than just relay stations. They were also rest houses for official travellers. Remember, the Mita labour tax meant that many people were constantly on the move, travelling to different regions to fulfil their work obligations. Soldiers marched to distant frontiers. Government officials travelled on inspection tours. Merchants transported goods. The tambos provided shelter, food, and supplies. They were stocked from the state warehouses and maintained by local communities as part of their tax obligation. A traveller on official business could walk from one end of the empire to the other, roughly 3,000 miles, and never have to worry about where they would sleep or what they would eat. But here's an important detail. These roads and tambos were not for everyone. The Kapak Yan was a royal road, reserved for state business. Ordinary people needed permission to travel on it. Guards were stationed at key points to check credentials. This wasn't oppression for its own sake. It was about control and efficiency. The empire needed to know who was moving where and why. One of the most impressive sections of the Kapak Yan was the coastal road. It ran parallel to the Pacific Ocean for over 2,000 miles, from Ecuador down through Peru and into Chile. Much of this route crossed absolute desert, places where water is so scarce that survival is measured in hours, not days. The Inca solved this problem with characteristic thoroughness. They established tambos at regular intervals, each one supplied with water brought from distant sources. They marked the road clearly so travelers wouldn't lose their way in the featureless sand. In some sections, they planted trees on both sides of the road for shade, irrigating them with carefully managed water channels. The mountain road, called the Kapak Yan, was even more dramatic. This route followed the spine of the Andes, climbing to elevations where altitude sickness could kill. In some places, the road became a narrow path carved into sheer cliff faces. In others, it was a monumental staircase, thousands of steps climbing up and down mountain passes. There's a section of the road near Cusco where you can still walk on the original Inca stones. Each step is worn smooth by 500 years of footsteps. As you climb, you gain altitude quickly. The air gets thin, your heart pounds, your lungs burn, and you realize that the Chasqui ran these routes. They sprinted up these stairs carrying messages, their bodies trained to function in conditions that would hospitalize most modern athletes. The roads also served a military purpose. The Inca could move armies with shocking speed. When a province rebelled or a border was threatened, thousands of soldiers could march to the crisis point in a matter of days. This rapid response capability was one of the keys to maintaining control over such a vast and diverse territory. But perhaps the most important function of the roads was symbolic. They were a physical manifestation of Inca power and order. They proved that the empire could tame the wildest landscape. They connected the parts into a whole. They made real the concept of Tawantinsuyu, the four parts together. Every bridge repaired, every tambo maintained, every step kept clear of debris, was an act of collective effort. It was the Mita system, made visible. It was proof that the social contract worked, that when everyone contributed, great things were possible. And these roads led everywhere. They led to the coast, where fishermen brought in their catch. They led to the highlands, where herders tended their llamas and alpacas. They led to the jungle, where exotic goods like coca leaves and bright feathers were gathered. And they led to secret places, hidden in the mountains, where the Sapa Inca would retreat to escape the pressures of ruling an empire. One of those secret places was built by the great Pachacuti himself. It was a royal estate, a sanctuary, a sacred site aligned with the movements of the sun and stars. It was connected to the capital by a road that climbed into clouds and seemed to end at the edge of the sky. That place was Machu Picchu. And to reach it, you would have to walk the Inca Trail, a path that still exists today, still walked by thousands of modern pilgrims seeking to touch the ancient past. But in Pachacuti's time, this was not a tourist trail. This was a sacred path, leading to a city that the world beyond the empire would not see for over 400 years. So, let us follow that path now. Let us climb into the clouds and discover the lost city that has captured the imagination of the entire world. Chapter 4. The Lost City in the Clouds. There are places in this world that feel like they shouldn't exist. Places so perfectly positioned, so beautifully conceived, that standing in them feels like stepping into a dream. Machu Picchu is one of those places. Picture this. You're standing on a narrow mountain ridge, 8,000 feet above sea level. On either side of you, the land drops away into dizzying green valleys. A river curves far below, its water white with rapids. All around you, jagged peaks pierce the sky, their summits often hidden in mist. And there, built right into the living rock of the mountain, is a city. Not ruins. Not yet. This is 1500, and Machu Picchu is alive. Stone buildings, with steep thatched roofs, line carefully planned plazas. Agricultural terraces march down the mountainside in geometric perfection, each level held by a perfectly fitted retaining wall. Water flows through stone channels, distributed to fountains throughout the city. People move through the streets, their clothing bright with colour, and above it all, on the highest point, stands a carved stone pillar reaching toward the sun. This is Machu Picchu before the Spanish, before the tourists, before the world even knew it existed. This is the secret royal estate of Pachacuti, the Earthshaker, the greatest Sapa Inca who ever lived. But here's the question that has obsessed scholars for over a century. Why? Why would anyone build a city here, in one of the most remote and inaccessible locations imaginable? What was Machu Picchu for? The honest answer is that we still don't know for certain. The Inca left no written records. The Spanish never found this place. And the oral traditions that might have explained its purpose were lost when the empire fell. What we have are the stones themselves and the clues they provide. Let's start with what we know. Machu Picchu was built around 1450 during the reign of Pachacuti. It was constructed incredibly quickly by Inca standards, probably in less than 50 years. It was not a large city. At its peak, it likely housed no more than 750 people, and it was not a military fortress, despite its dramatic location. So, what was it? The leading theory is that Machu Picchu was a royal estate, a kind of sacred retreat for the Sapa Inca and his court. Think of it as a combination of a palace, a temple complex, and an astronomical observatory, all wrapped into one. It was a place where the ruler could escape the demands of governing, a place to commune with the gods in a setting of almost supernatural beauty. The location itself tells us something important. Machu Picchu sits between two sacred peaks. The taller mountain looming behind the city is called Huayna Picchu, which means young peak. The site is named for the other mountain, Machu Picchu, the old peak. These mountains were huacas, sacred places where the physical world touched the divine. The city is also positioned with extraordinary astronomical precision. The Inca were sophisticated astronomers. They tracked the movements of the sun, moon, stars, and planets with great accuracy. Their agricultural calendar, their religious festivals, their entire understanding of time was based on celestial observation. At the highest point of Machu Picchu stands a structure that has become iconic. It's a carved stone pillar rising from a sculpted rock platform. The Spanish called structures like this Intihuatana, which means hitching post of the sun. The Inca believed that during the winter solstice, when the sun was at its weakest and farthest from the earth, special rituals had to be performed to call it back, to symbolically tie it to the earth so it wouldn't disappear forever. The Intihuatana at Machu Picchu is aligned with such precision that on the equinoxes, the sun stands directly above it at noon, casting no shadow. Stand next to it at that moment, and you are at the exact center of the Inca cosmos. You are at the point where Earth touches sky. But Machu Picchu wasn't just about looking up. It was also about looking inward. The city is divided into distinct sectors, each with its own purpose. There's an urban sector with residential buildings, storage houses, and workshops. There's an agricultural sector with those magnificent terraces, and there's a sacred sector with temples and ceremonial platforms. The most important building in the sacred sector is called the Temple of the Sun. It's a curved tower built around a natural rock outcrop, fitted so perfectly to the stone that you can't see where nature ends and human work begins. Inside, there are windows aligned with the sunrise on the winter solstice. On that sacred day, light would flood through the window and illuminate a ceremonial altar. Beneath the Temple of the Sun is a cave, carved and shaped into a royal tomb. Was this intended for Pachacuti himself? Was his mummy kept here, brought out for ceremonies and festivals? We don't know. The tomb was empty when it was discovered. Whatever treasures or remains it once held were removed long ago, either by the Inca themselves when they abandoned the city, or by looters who found it before the modern world did. Near the temple is another mysterious structure called the Temple of the Three Windows. It's a building with three large trapezoidal windows facing east toward the sunrise. The number 3 was sacred to the Inca. They believed in 3 worlds: the world above, the world of the living, and the world below. These windows might represent that cosmic division, or they might commemorate the 3 caves from which the first Inca ancestors were said to have emerged. The more you explore Machu Picchu, the more you realize that every stone has meaning. This wasn't just a city. It was a statement written in granite. It was theology made solid. It was a place designed to bring humans closer to the divine. But it was also a place designed for living. The residential sector contains buildings of different qualities. Some are roughly built, with field stone walls. These were likely for servants and workers. Others are made with the finest polygonal masonry, stones fitted with that impossible Inca precision. These were for nobles and priests. There's even evidence of a sophisticated class system within this small population. Analysis of the remains found at the site shows that some individuals had access to much better food and lived longer, healthier lives than others. Even in paradise, inequality existed. Water was sacred to the Inca, and at Machu Picchu, they created a masterpiece of hydraulic engineering. A spring on the mountain slope above the city was tapped and channeled into a series of 16 stone fountains, each one flowing into the next. The water descends through the city in a carefully designed cascade. The first fountain was reserved for the Sapa Inca himself. The rest served the population in order of rank. This water system has been functioning for over 500 years. Turn it on today, and water still flows from fountain to fountain, exactly as it did when Pachacuti watched it from his palace window. The agricultural terraces that surround the city are another marvel. They're not just retaining walls holding back soil. They're sophisticated structures with multiple layers. At the bottom is a drainage layer of rocks and gravel to prevent waterlogging. Above that is sand, and on top is the fertile soil where crops were grown. These terraces served multiple purposes. They provided food for the city's population. They prevented erosion on the steep slopes. And they created microclimates, with each level having slightly different temperature and humidity, allowing the Inca to grow a variety of crops in a small space. The Inca grew corn, potatoes, quinoa, and many other crops at Machu Picchu. They also cultivated coca, the sacred leaf that was chewed to combat altitude sickness and hunger, and reserved for nobles and priests. And they grew flowers, purely for beauty. This was a place where aesthetics mattered as much as practicality. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Machu Picchu is something that didn't happen. The Spanish never found it. When the conquistadors arrived and the empire collapsed, Machu Picchu was quietly abandoned. The people left. The thatched roofs rotted away. The jungle began to creep back in, vines climbing the walls, trees growing in the plazas. But the stones remained, waiting. For over 400 years, Machu Picchu was forgotten by the outside world. Local people knew about it. Farmers used some of the terraces. But it wasn't on any map. It wasn't in any Spanish chronicle. It was a ghost city, hidden in the clouds. And then, on a July morning in 1911, an American historian named Hiram Bingham was led up a steep jungle path by a local boy. Bingham was looking for Vilcabamba, the last refuge of the Inca rebels. What he found instead was something far more spectacular. He pushed through the jungle and suddenly stood before walls of white granite covered in moss and vines. He later wrote that he couldn't believe his eyes. Here, in one of the most remote locations he'd ever visited, were ruins of the finest quality Inca stonework. Bingham returned to Yale University and organized expeditions to clear and study the site. He believed he had found Vilcabamba. He was wrong about that. But he had found something equally important, a nearly intact Inca city that showed the world what the empire had been capable of at its height. The rediscovery of Machu Picchu created a sensation. Photographs of the site, with its dramatic mountain backdrop, appeared in National Geographic and newspapers around the world. This lost city in the clouds captured the imagination of an entire generation. Today, Machu Picchu is the most visited tourist destination in South America. Over 1 million people walk its stones every year. It's been designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's been called one of the new 7 wonders of the world. But for all the visitors, for all the study, Machu Picchu keeps its secrets. We still don't know exactly why it was built. We don't know why it was abandoned. We don't know what rituals were performed on its ceremonial platforms, or what knowledge was recorded by the priests who watched the stars from its high towers. What we do know is that standing in Machu Picchu, especially early in the morning when mist rises from the valleys and the sun breaks over the peaks, feels like standing at the edge of mystery. It feels like touching something ancient and profound, something that speaks to a different way of seeing the world. The Inca built this city not to conquer, but to honor. They built it to create a place where the boundary between human and divine was thin. They built it as a testament to what was possible when skill, vision, and reverence came together. And in doing so, they created something that would outlast their empire, outlast the Spanish conquest, outlast centuries of forgetting. They created a place that still has the power to make us stop and wonder. But to truly understand Machu Picchu and the civilization that built it, we need to understand something that seems impossible to modern minds. We need to understand how the Inca built an empire without money. Chapter 5. The Empire Without Money. Here's something that will challenge everything you think you know about how civilizations work. The Inca Empire, one of the largest and most sophisticated states in history, had no money. None. No coins. No currency. No medium of exchange. They also had no markets in the way we understand them. No shops. no buying and selling in the traditional sense. And yet they fed, clothed, and housed 12 million people. They built cities and roads. They maintained armies. They created art and architecture that still astounds us today. How is that even possible? The answer lies in a completely different way of organizing society, an economic system based not on profit and trade, but on reciprocity and redistribution. The Inca economy was built on two fundamental concepts, Aini and Mita. We've mentioned these words before, but now let's really understand what they meant. Aini was the principle of reciprocal exchange. It meant mutual obligation, the sacred duty to give and receive. If your neighbor helped you build your house, you would help harvest his crops. If the community built a bridge, everyone who used it had an obligation to maintain it. This wasn't charity. It wasn't voluntary. It was the fundamental rule of social existence. Aini operated at every level of society, between individuals, between families, between communities, and between the people and the state. The Sapa Inca provided protection, stability, and food security. In return, the people provided labor. This was the contract that held everything together. The Mita was how that labor was organized. Every able-bodied person in the empire, male and female, owed a certain amount of work to the state each year. This wasn't a tax paid in money. It was a tax paid in time and effort. The Mita built the roads. It built the temples and palaces. It terraced the mountainsides for agriculture. It mined gold and silver. It wove textiles. It served in the army. Everything the state needed was provided through this system of organized labor. Here's how it worked in practice. Let's say you're a farmer living in a village in the highlands. Most of your time is spent working your own land, growing potatoes and quinoa to feed your family. But several times a year, a government official would arrive and inform you that your Mita service was required. You might be assigned to work on building a new section of road. You'd leave your village and join a crew of other Mita workers. You'd be fed from state warehouses. You'd be given tools. And for a set period, maybe a few weeks or a few months, you'd cut stones and lay pavement. Or you might be assigned to military service, joining a unit, marching to a distant frontier. Or you might be sent to work in the state's agricultural terraces, growing corn that would be stored in government warehouses. When your service was complete, you'd return home. Your family's land would still be there, waiting for you. And, in your absence, the community would have helped your wife and children with their work. That was Aini at the local level. The Mita system only worked because of the kolkas, the massive state warehouses we mentioned earlier. These were stone buildings with sophisticated ventilation systems designed to keep food dry and preserved. They were scattered throughout the empire, positioned along the roads and near major cities. The kolkas were filled with everything the empire needed. Dried potatoes, called chunyo, which could last for years. Corn, quinoa, dried meat. Wool, cotton. Finished textiles. Weapons, tools. Everything was catalogued and tracked using Quipus. When a region suffered a crop failure due to drought or flood, the state would open the local kolkhes and distribute food. This safety net was one of the reasons the Inca could expand so successfully. People were willing to join the empire because it offered protection from starvation. The Spanish chroniclers were amazed by this system. One wrote that in the Inca Empire, there were no poor people. Everyone had enough to eat. Everyone had clothing. Everyone had shelter. The idea of someone starving while warehouses sat full was unthinkable. Now, this might sound like a utopia, but let's be clear-eyed about it. This was not a society of equals. The Mita system could be brutal. The state decided where you worked and for how long. You had no choice. And the work could be dangerous, especially mining or military service. Also, the benefits were not distributed equally. The Sapa Inca and the noble class lived in incredible luxury. They wore clothing made from the finest vicuña wool, softer than cashmere. They ate from gold and silver plates. They drank from jeweled cups. The palace complexes in Cusco were filled with treasures that would later drive the Spanish mad with greed. But here's what's interesting. Even that wealth wasn't really owned in the way we think of ownership. When a Sapa Inca died, his mummy was preserved, and his entire estate, his palaces, his lands, his treasures, remained his. His descendants maintained his household as if he were still alive. The new Sapa Inca had to build his own palaces, accumulate his own wealth. This created an interesting problem. Each new ruler needed to expand the empire to gain new lands and resources. It was a system that incentivized constant conquest. By the time the Spanish arrived, the empire was straining under the weight of supporting dozens of royal mummy cults, each one maintaining vast estates for rulers who had been dead for generations. Now let's talk about the quipus in more detail, because they're one of the most fascinating and mysterious technologies the Inca developed. A quipu is a collection of coloured strings, usually made from cotton or alpaca wool, with knots tied at various intervals. They hang from a main cord like a fringe. The colour of each string has meaning. The position of the knots has meaning. The type of knot has meaning. Even the direction the knot is tied has meaning. We know that quipus were used to record numerical data, tax records, census information, inventory of warehouse contents. The Inca used a decimal system, and the position of knots along the string indicated units, tens, hundreds, and thousands. But here's where it gets mysterious. Some scholars believe quipus also recorded narrative information, stories, histories, even poetry. If this is true, then quipus were not just accounting tools. They were a form of writing, just not one we know how to read anymore. When the Spanish arrived, they destroyed most of the quipus they found. The few that survive are in museums, silent and indecipherable. There are people today, descendants of the Inca, who are trying to recreate the knowledge of how to read them. It's a race against time, trying to recover a lost language before it disappears forever. The Inca also had specialists called quipu kamayoks, quipu keepers. These were highly trained individuals with extraordinary memories. They could read the quipus and recite the information encoded in them. They were the librarians and accountants of the empire. When the Spanish asked how the Inca kept track of such a vast empire without writing, they were shown the quipus. But the conquistadors dismissed them as primitive tools. They couldn't imagine that a civilization without an alphabet could be sophisticated. They were wrong. The Inca economy also involved some forms of exchange that look more familiar to us. There were regional specializations. Coastal communities provided fish and seaweed. Highland communities provided wool and potatoes. Jungle communities provided coca, bright feathers, and exotic woods. These goods moved through the empire, but not through markets. They moved through the redistribution system. Local products were collected as part of the mita tax and stored in QOCAs. Then they were redistributed to other regions based on need and state priorities. There was also some local bartering. If you had extra potatoes and your neighbour had extra wool, you might trade directly. But this was small-scale and informal. It didn't drive the economy the way markets do in capitalist societies. The Inca approach to economics was fundamentally collectivist. The needs of the state and the community came before individual profit. This made certain things possible that would be impossible in a market economy. Massive public works projects could be completed because labour could be organised on a scale that no private enterprise could match. But it also meant that individual freedom was limited. You couldn't just decide to become a merchant and try to get rich. Your role in society was largely determined by birth and by the needs of the state. When the Spanish arrived and tried to impose a money-based economy, it caused massive disruption. Suddenly, people were expected to pay taxes in silver, but they had no way to earn silver. The entire social structure began to collapse. The Inca economic system seems alien to us now. We live in a world where money mediates almost every relationship. The idea of a complex civilization functioning without it seems impossible. But the Inca proved it could be done. Whether their system was better or worse than ours is a question each person has to answer for themselves. What's undeniable is that it was different, and that studying it expands our understanding of what's possible in human society. But the Inca weren't just practical administrators building roads and moving potatoes. They were also deeply spiritual people with a rich religious life. To understand them fully, we need to enter their temples and stand before their altars. We need to understand their gods. Chapter 6. Gods, Gold, and Sacrifice. The Inca lived in a world alive with divinity. Every mountain was a god. Every river had a spirit. The sun, the moon, the stars, even the earth beneath their feet. All were conscious beings that could be pleased or angered, that demanded respect and offerings. This wasn't superstition to them. It was reality. The sacred and the mundane were not separate spheres. They were woven together, inseparable, like the threads in one of their magnificent textiles. At the center of everything was Inti, the sun god. Inti was not just the most important god. He was the source of all life, all warmth, all growth. Without the sun, crops would not grow. Without the sun, there would be no light, no heat, no life. The Sapa Inca himself was believed to be the direct descendant of Inti, a living god walking among mortals. The greatest temple in the empire, perhaps the greatest building the Inca ever created, was dedicated to Inti. It was called Coricancha, which means golden courtyard or golden enclosure. It stood in the heart of Cusco, and what the Spanish found there when they first entered the city left them speechless. The main temple building was covered, inside and out, with sheets of pure gold. The walls gleamed like captured sunlight. In the center of the main hall stood a massive golden disc, representing the sun itself, positioned so that the first rays of dawn would strike it and fill the entire room with reflected golden light. Around the walls were golden statues and figures. There were golden representations of corn stalks, life-sized, with leaves and ears of corn all fashioned from precious metal. There was a garden where everything, the flowers, the butterflies, even the dirt, was made of gold and silver. The Spanish, when they saw this, saw only wealth. They saw the solution to all their financial problems. They melted it all down. Every statue, every sheet of gold, every sacred object was thrown into furnaces and transformed into bars to be shipped back to Spain. One of the greatest artistic achievements in human history was destroyed in a matter of weeks, reduced to its raw material value. But before that destruction, Coricancha was the beating heart of Inca religion. It wasn't just a temple to Inti. It contained smaller shrines to other important gods. There was a shrine to Quilla, the moon goddess, wife of Inti. There was a shrine to Ilapa, the god of thunder and rain. There was a shrine to Chasca, the goddess of the dawn and twilight. And there was something else at Coricancha that reveals something profound about Inca religion. The mummies of previous Sapa Incas were kept there, seated on golden thrones, dressed in their finest clothing, attended by servants. You see, the Inca didn't believe that death ended a person's existence in the world. The dead remained present, especially powerful individuals like former rulers. These mummies were brought out for festivals and ceremonies. They were offered food and drink. They were consulted on important decisions. In a very real sense, they still ruled alongside the living Sapa Inca. This practice horrified the Spanish, who saw it as paganism of the worst sort. But to the Inca, it was natural. The boundary between life and death was not absolute. It was permeable. The most important festival in the Inca calendar was Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun. It was celebrated at the winter solstice in June, the time when the sun was farthest from the earth and needed to be called back. The entire population of Cusco, which could swell to over 100,000 people during festivals, would gather in the great plaza. The Sapa Inca himself would perform the central ritual. He would face the rising sun and call out to his divine father, asking him to return, to bring warmth and life back to the earth. Llamas were sacrificed. Their blood was offered to the sun. Coca leaves were burned. Chicha, the fermented corn beer that was the ceremonial drink of the Inca, was poured into special channels that drained into the earth, feeding the gods below. Music filled the air. Not the music we might expect, but haunting melodies played on pan flutes, drums made from animal skin, and shell trumpets. The sound echoed off the mountains, as if the earth itself was singing. The festival lasted for days. There was feasting, dancing, and ritual combat. The mummies of dead rulers were brought out and placed in positions of honor, as if they too were watching and participating. Today, in modern Cusco, Inti Raymi is still celebrated every year on June 24th. It's become a tourist attraction, a spectacular performance with hundreds of actors in traditional costume. But it's based on real historical accounts, a window into what the ancient ceremony might have looked like. The Inca made many offerings to their gods. Most were simple: corn, coca leaves, textiles. But for the most important occasions, for times of crisis or great need, they made the ultimate offering. They offered human life. The practice was called capacocha. It was not done lightly or frequently. It was reserved for moments of supreme importance: the death of a Sapa Inca, a major military victory, a devastating natural disaster. Children were chosen for capacocha, usually between the ages of 6 and 15. They were selected for their physical perfection. Any blemish or deformity would make them unacceptable as an offering to the gods. These children came from noble families, and being chosen was considered a great honor. The children would be brought to Cusco and honored in ceremonies at Coricancha. They would be given fine clothing and food. Then they would begin a pilgrimage to a sacred mountain, often one of the highest peaks in the empire. At the summit, in a small stone structure built specifically for the ceremony, the children would be given chicha, laced with coca. They would become drowsy, then unconscious. In that state, they would be left on the mountain, where the cold would take them peacefully. The Inca believed these children didn't die. They believed they were transformed, that they became intermediaries between the human world and the divine. They would watch over their communities from the sacred mountain, protecting them from harm. This practice is deeply disturbing to us. It should be, but it's important to understand it in context. The Inca genuinely believed they were giving these children the greatest possible honor and the most important possible role. And the children, raised in this belief system, often went to their deaths willingly, even proudly. We know about Capacocha in such detail because of a discovery made in 1999 on a mountain called Lulailaco, on the border between Argentina and Chile. Archaeologists found 3 mummies of children, perfectly preserved by the cold and dry conditions at over 22,000 feet elevation. The bodies were so well preserved that scientists could study their last meals, their clothing, even their DNA. One child, a girl about 13 years old, became known as the Maiden. Her face was peaceful. She looked like she was sleeping. Around her were buried offerings, small statues made of gold and silver, fine textiles, and food for her journey to the next world. These discoveries have given us an unprecedented window into Inca religion. But they've also raised ethical questions. Should these bodies be displayed in museums? Or should they be reburied with honor? It's a debate that continues today. Not all Inca religious practices involve death and sacrifice. Many were about celebration and connection. One of the most important roles in Inca society was held by women called the Aklas, often translated as the chosen women. Young girls, usually around age 10, would be selected for their beauty and talents. They would be taken to special houses called aklawasi, where they would be trained in weaving, cooking, and religious rituals. They were taught to make chicha and to weave the incredibly fine textiles that only the Sapa, Inca, and the gods could wear. Some of these women would become mamaconas, priestesses dedicated to the service of Inti. They took vows of perpetual virginity and spent their lives in the temple. Others would eventually be given as wives to nobles or military commanders as rewards for service. And some, the most beautiful and accomplished, would become secondary wives of the Sapa Inca himself. The Aklawasi was a place of privilege, but also of confinement. The women who lived there had honor and importance, but they had no freedom. Their lives were entirely dedicated to serving the state and the gods. The Inca also practiced divination. Priests would read the future in the patterns of coca leaves thrown on the ground, in the movement of spiders, in the entrails of sacrificed animals. Before any major decision, before any military campaign, before any important construction project, the priests would be consulted, and they took these signs seriously. There are accounts of military expeditions being cancelled because the omens were unfavourable. of construction being halted because the priests declared the day inauspicious. Throughout the empire, there were thousands of huacas, sacred places. Some were natural formations, oddly shaped rocks, springs, caves, mountain peaks. Others were human-made, temples, shrines, tombs. Cusco itself was organized around a system of lines called seques that radiated out from Coricancha, connecting hundreds of huacas in a sacred geography. Walking these sec lines was a form of pilgrimage. Each huaca had its own rituals, its own offerings, its own festivals. The entire landscape was a living map of the spiritual world. Gold and silver had special meaning in this religious context. Gold was the sweat of the sun. Silver was the tears of the moon. These metals were not valued for their economic worth. They were sacred substances, physical manifestations of divine power. This is why the temples were covered in them. When the Spanish melted down the gold of Coricancha, they didn't just destroy art. They destroyed something that to the Inca was literally part of the divine. It was a spiritual catastrophe as much as a cultural one. The Inca religious system was complex and sophisticated. It had professional priests, elaborate rituals, sacred texts recorded in quippus, and a theology that explained the origin of the world and humanity's place in it. But it also had a fundamental vulnerability. It was centered entirely on the person of the Sapa Inca. He was the link between the human and divine worlds. He performed the most important rituals. His person was sacred. To even look directly at him without permission was taboo. This meant that when the Sapa Inca fell, the entire religious and political system was vulnerable to collapse. And that's exactly what happened when a group of Spanish soldiers, led by an illiterate pig farmer named Francisco Pizarro, arrived on the coast of Peru in 1532. But before we get to that tragic ending, we need to understand that the empire was already fracturing from within. A civil war had just torn the Tawantinsuyu apart. Two brothers, both sons of the previous Sapa Inca, had fought for control. By the time Pizarro arrived, the empire was wounded and divided. And that division would be the crack through which everything would shatter. Chapter 7. The Last Inca and the Fall. The beginning of the end started with a disease that no Inca had ever seen before. It arrived before the Spanish themselves did, spreading along trade routes from Central America, where Spanish conquistadors had already made contact with indigenous peoples. It was smallpox. The Inca had no immunity to European diseases. Smallpox swept through the empire like wildfire, killing vast numbers of people. And in 1527, it killed Sapa Inca Huayna Capac, the 11th ruler, along with his chosen heir. This created a succession crisis. Huayna Capac had many sons by various wives. Two of them, Huasca and Atahualpa, both believed they had the right to rule. Huasca was older and had the support of the traditional nobility in Cusco. Atahualpa was a military commander who had his father's favour and the loyalty of the army stationed in the north. What followed was a brutal civil war that tore the empire in half. Brother fought against brother. Communities were forced to choose sides. The war raged for 5 years, and when it finally ended, Atahualpa had won. But the victory was Pyrrhic. Tens of thousands had died. The infrastructure of the empire was damaged. Trust between regions was shattered. And in the north, an army of perhaps 80,000 battle-hardened warriors was loyal to Atahualpa personally, not to the institution of the Sapa Inca. It was at this moment, with the empire wounded and divided, that Francisco Pizarro landed on the coast with 168 men. Pizarro was not a noble. He was not educated. He was the illegitimate son of a Spanish soldier and had grown up herding pigs. But he'd been in the Americas for 20 years. He'd accompanied Balboa when he discovered the Pacific Ocean. He'd heard rumors of a rich empire in the south, an empire with more gold than the Aztec state that Hernán Cortés had just conquered in Mexico. Pizarro wanted that gold, and he was willing to do anything to get it. He marched inland with his small force. They were equipped with steel swords and armor, firearms, and horses. None of these things existed in the Inca world. To the indigenous people they encountered, the Spanish seemed like beings from another reality. Atahualpa, having just won his civil war, was encamped with his army at a town called Cajamarca in the northern highlands. He'd heard about these strange, bearded men and their bizarre animals. He was curious. He agreed to meet with them. On November 16th, 1532, Atahualpa entered the plaza of Cajamarca, carried on a golden litter by 80 nobles. He was surrounded by thousands of unarmed attendants, dressed in their finest clothing, singing and celebrating their emperor's recent victory. Pizarro and his men were hidden in the buildings around the plaza. A Spanish priest approached Atahualpa and, through a translator, tried to explain Christianity and demanded that he submit to the Spanish king and the Pope. Atahualpa was confused and insulted. He was a living god. He submitted to no one. He reportedly threw the Bible the priest was holding to the ground. This was the signal Pizarro had been waiting for. He gave the order. Cannons fired into the crowded plaza. Spanish soldiers charged out of the buildings, swords swinging. Horses, which the Inca had never seen before, trampled people in panic. It was a massacre. Thousands of unarmed Inca died in less than an hour. Not a single Spanish soldier was killed. Atahualpa was captured, pulled from his litter, and taken prisoner. The entire army camped outside the town, hearing the sounds of slaughter, did nothing. Their sacred ruler had been taken. The divine order had been shattered. They were paralyzed by shock and confusion. Atahualpa, desperate to secure his release, made Pizarro an offer. He would fill the room he was being held in with gold, once and twice with silver. The room was about 22 feet long and 17 feet wide. He said he could do this in 2 months. Pizarro agreed. Word went out across the empire. Gold poured in from temples, from palaces, from the treasuries of nobles. Golden statues, ceremonial objects, sheets of gold torn from the walls of Coricancha, all of it was brought to Cajamarca and piled in that room. It took longer than 2 months, but eventually the room was filled. The amount of gold and silver was staggering, worth many millions of dollars in today's money. The Spanish melted it all down, destroying priceless works of art, and divided it among themselves. And then, despite having received the ransom, Pizarro had Atahualpa put on trial for various crimes, including the murder of his brother Huasca. The trial was a farce. The verdict was predetermined. Atahualpa was sentenced to be burned at the stake. The Inca believed that the body needed to be intact for the afterlife. The thought of being burned filled Atahualpa with horror. He agreed to be baptized as a Christian if his sentence would be changed. The Spanish agreed. He was baptized, given the Christian name Juan, and then strangled to death with a garrote on July 26, 1533. The death of Atahualpa did not end Inca resistance. The Spanish installed a puppet ruler, Manco Inca, a younger son of Huayna Capac. They thought he would be easy to control. They were wrong. Manco observed the Spanish carefully. He saw how few they really were. He saw their weaknesses. And in 1536, he rose in rebellion. He gathered a huge army and laid siege to Cusco itself, which the Spanish now occupied. The siege lasted for months. At one point, the Inca set fire to the thatched roofs of the city, and the Spanish were trapped in stone buildings, surrounded by flames. But they held out. Spanish reinforcements arrived, and eventually, Manco was forced to retreat. He didn't surrender. Instead, he fled deep into the jungle, to a region called Vilcabamba. There, in one of the most remote and inaccessible parts of the empire, he established a rebel state. For the next 36 years, the Inca continued to rule in Vilcabamba, maintaining their independence, raiding Spanish settlements, and keeping alive the hope of restoration. Vilcabamba became known as the lost city of the Incas. It was the place Hiram Bingham thought he'd found when he discovered Machu Picchu. He was wrong. Vilcabamba was eventually located in a different part of the jungle, at a site now called Espiritu Pampa. The rebel state survived through several rulers. Manco Inca was eventually assassinated by Spanish refugees he'd given shelter to. His sons succeeded him, but the pressure from the Spanish never relented. And in 1572, the Spanish finally decided to end it. They launched a military expedition into Vilcabamba, The last supper Inca, Tupac Amaru, the grandson of Manco, was captured. He was brought back to Cusco and put on trial. Despite protests from some Spanish officials who thought executing him was unjust, he was sentenced to death. On September 24, 1572, Tupac Amaru was brought to the plaza of Cusco, the same plaza where his ancestors had celebrated Inti Raymi, and beheaded. Thousands of indigenous people watched in silence as the last legitimate Sapa Inca died. According to witnesses, as the executioner raised his sword, Tupac Amaru held up his hand and spoke to the crowd. He told them to abandon any hope of resistance, to accept the Spanish rule, and to convert to Christianity. Then he lowered his hand, and the sword fell. With his death, the Inca Empire officially ended. It had lasted less than a century as a major power. It had been conquered by a force of fewer than 200 men, aided by disease, by internal division, and by the shock of encountering a completely alien civilization. But the story doesn't quite end there. The Inca people didn't disappear. Their descendants are still here. Millions of people in Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and other countries trace their ancestry to the Tawantinsuyu. They still speak Quechua. They still farm the ancient terraces. They still remember. And the stones remain. The temples and fortresses and cities, built with that impossible precision, still stand. They survived the conquest. They survived the centuries. And they still have the power to make us stop and wonder at what was achieved. The fall of the Inca Empire was not just a military conquest. It was a collision of worlds, a meeting of two completely different ways of understanding reality. Neither side could truly comprehend the other. The Spanish saw the Inca as pagans sitting on piles of gold. The Inca saw the Spanish as strange, incomprehensible beings who broke every sacred law. In the end, steel and germs and horses won. But they couldn't erase the memory. They couldn't destroy the stones. And they couldn't kill the story. Chapter 8. The Legacy Written in Stone. The empire fell. The Spanish melted the gold. The temples were torn down and churches built on their foundations. The Sapa Inca died, and the royal mummies were destroyed. It looked, for a time, as if the Inca civilization would be erased from history, remembered only as a footnote in the story of Spanish conquest. But you can't kill stone, and you can't erase a culture that has woven itself into the fabric of the land. Today, more than 5 centuries after the fall of Tawantinsuyu, the legacy of the Inca is everywhere. Not just in museums and archaeological sites, but in the living, breathing culture of the Andes. The empire ended, but the people and their traditions survived. Let's start with language. Quechua, the tongue of the Inca, is still spoken by approximately 10 million people across South America. In Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, it's an official language. Children learn it in school. Radio stations broadcast in it. Poets write in it. Quechua gave us words that have entered languages around the world. Condor, puma, llama, quinoa, coca, guano, jerky, which comes from the Quechua word charqui, meaning dried meat. Every time you eat a granola bar with quinoa or see a nature documentary about condors, you're touching a thread that connects back to the Inca. But the deepest legacy is in agriculture. The Inca were master farmers, and the crops they cultivated have transformed the world's diet in ways most people don't even realize. The potato originated in the Andes. The Inca cultivated thousands of varieties, each one adapted to specific elevations and climates. When the Spanish brought potatoes back to Europe, they changed history. The potato became a staple crop that could feed more people per acre than wheat. It fueled population growth. It sustained armies. Some historians argue that the potato made the Industrial Revolution possible by providing cheap, reliable nutrition for factory workers. Today, potatoes are the 4th most important food crop in the world, after rice, wheat, and corn. And every single potato can trace its ancestry back to the Andes, back to the terraces where Inca farmers carefully selected and bred them over centuries. The same is true for corn. While corn was cultivated throughout the Americas, the Inca developed specific varieties suited to high-altitude growing. They understood crop rotation, fertilization with bird guano, and irrigation techniques that modern farmers still study and admire. And then there's quinoa. For thousands of years, it was a staple food in the Andes, cultivated by the Inca and their predecessors. The Spanish looked down on it as Indian food and tried to suppress its cultivation, pushing wheat instead. But the indigenous people never stopped growing and eating quinoa. In the last 20 years, the rest of the world has discovered what the Inca knew all along. Quinoa is a nutritional powerhouse, a complete protein, adaptable and delicious. Today, it's a global superfood. Grown on several continents, sold in grocery stores from New York to Tokyo. Every time you eat a quinoa salad, you're eating history. The Inca also gave us sophisticated agricultural techniques that are being rediscovered by modern farmers. Those terraced hillsides, which look so beautiful in photographs, weren't just aesthetic, they were brilliant engineering solutions to the challenge of farming in mountains. The terraces created microclimates. They prevented erosion. They managed water drainage. Scientists today are studying Inca terraces to understand sustainable agriculture in challenging environments. Some of these terraces are being restored and brought back into cultivation after centuries of abandonment. And they still work, exactly as they were designed to. The Inca understanding of freeze-drying is another gift to the world. They invented a process for preserving potatoes called chuño. The potatoes would be spread out on the ground during freezing nights, then trampled during the day to squeeze out moisture, then frozen again. After several cycles, the result was a dried potato that could be stored for years and reconstituted with water when needed. This technique preserved food without refrigeration or canning, and it allowed the Inca to create those massive state warehouses that fed the empire. Today, the principle of freeze-drying is used to preserve everything from coffee to blood plasma for medical use. But the most visible legacy, the one that draws visitors from around the entire world, is the architecture. The stones that the Spanish couldn't destroy, the cities they never found. Machu Picchu receives over 1.5 million visitors each year. People come from every continent to stand in that sacred place and feel the connection to something ancient and profound. It's been designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized as one of humanity's most important cultural treasures. In 2007, it was named one of the new 7 wonders of the world through a global poll. But Machu Picchu is just one site among hundreds. The Inca left their mark all across the Andes. In Peru alone, there are dozens of significant Inca ruins, each one telling part of the story. Sacsayhuaman still towers over Cusco, its massive stones, a permanent reminder of what the Inca could achieve. Ollantaytambo, a fortress and ceremonial center in the Sacred Valley, is so well preserved that you can walk through its streets and temples and feel like you've stepped back in time. Parts of the town are still inhabited, making it one of the oldest continuously occupied settlements in South America. Pisac, another Sacred Valley site, has agricultural terraces that sweep down the mountainside in graceful curves, each stone perfectly placed. Moray has circular terraces arranged in concentric rings, descending into the earth like an amphitheatre. Scientists believe this was an agricultural laboratory where the Inca experimented with growing crops at different temperatures and elevations. And then there's the Huapac Yan itself. In 2014, extensive sections of the Inca road system were designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The designation covers over 4,000 miles of roads across 6 countries: Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Today, you can still walk parts of these ancient roads. The most famous trek is the Inca Trail to Machu Picchu, a 26-mile path that follows the original Inca route. Tens of thousands of people hike it every year, walking in the literal footsteps of the Chasqui, crossing the same mountain passes, seeing the same breathtaking views. Along the trail, there are Inca ruins at regular intervals. Rungcuraque, a circular structure that was likely a tambo. Sayakmarca, a fortress perched on a cliff. Fuyupatamarca, the cloud-level town, often shrouded in mist. And finally, passing through Intipunku, the Sun Gate, hikers get their first view of Machu Picchu spread out below them, just as Inca travelers would have seen it 500 years ago. Walking that trail is more than tourism. It's pilgrimage. People come from all over the world, often pushed to their physical limits by the altitude and the challenging terrain, to experience something they can't find anywhere else, a direct connection to an ancient civilization. But this popularity comes with a price. Machu Picchu and the Inca Trail are loved almost to death. The stone steps are being worn down by millions of footsteps. The fragile ecosystem around the sites is under pressure. UNESCO has placed limits on the number of visitors allowed each day. There are ongoing debates about how to preserve these places while still allowing people to experience them. The Peruvian government and international organizations are working to find that balance. Some argue for stricter limits. Others are promoting alternative treks to lesser-known Inca sites to distribute the tourist pressure. It's a complex challenge with no easy answers. One thing is clear, though. These sites must be preserved. They're not just stones and walls. They're the physical memory of a civilization. They're proof of human ingenuity, perseverance, and vision. Losing them would be losing a piece of our collective human heritage. The cultural legacy of the Inca extends beyond the ruins. Throughout Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, you can see the influence in daily life. Traditional clothing in many communities still uses patterns and techniques that date back to the Inca or earlier. The bright, geometric designs in textiles aren't just decoration. They carry meaning, telling stories, indicating the wearer's community and status. Music is another living connection. The haunting melodies played on pan flutes, the drums, the shell trumpets. These instruments and these sounds have been part of Andean culture for thousands of years. Modern Andean music blends these traditional elements with contemporary styles, creating something that honors the past while living in the present. And then there are the festivals. Throughout the former empire, communities celebrate festivals that blend Catholic traditions imposed by the Spanish with much older indigenous practices. Inti Raymi, the Festival of the Sun, is celebrated every June 24th in Cusco with a massive theatrical recreation of the ancient ceremony. Thousands participate, hundreds of thousands watch. It's become one of the largest festivals in South America. But smaller communities have their own festivals, often tied to agricultural cycles, just as they were in Inca times. The Planting Festival, the Harvest Festival, the Festival of the Cross that coincides with the Southern Hemisphere's autumn, all of these carry echoes of pre-Columbian practices wrapped in Christian symbolism. The Inca practiced a concept called aini, remember, mutual reciprocity, mutual obligation. That concept is still alive in Andean communities. When someone needs help building a house or harvesting crops, the community comes together, not because they're paid, but because of aini. Because today, I help you, and tomorrow, when I need help, you'll be there. This is the Inca legacy that can't be put in a museum or photographed for a postcard. It's a way of thinking about community and obligation that has survived conquest, colonization, modernization, and globalization. The Spanish tried to erase the Inca. They destroyed the temples, killed the rulers, outlawed the religion, and suppressed the language. For a time, it looked like they might succeed. But they underestimated the power of culture to survive, to adapt, to hide itself when necessary, and emerge again when it's safe. Today, there's a renaissance of indigenous pride in the Andes. People are reclaiming Inca identity, learning Quechua, studying their history, and celebrating their heritage. In Peru, when someone accomplishes something notable, it's common to hear the phrase, "Que orgullo," what pride. And increasingly, that pride is tied to being descended from the Inca. This isn't about living in the past. It's about carrying the past forward. It's about recognizing that the Inca weren't just some ancient civilization that disappeared. They're ancestors. Their blood runs in millions of people alive today. Their crops feed the world. Their roads still cross the mountains. Their buildings still stand. And their story still has the power to inspire. When you stand in Machu Picchu and look at those impossibly fitted stones, you're not just seeing engineering skill, you're seeing ambition. You're seeing a civilization that refused to let mountains and valleys and impossible terrain stop them from building something magnificent. When you learn about the Carpathian, stretching thousands of miles across some of the hardest terrain on Earth. You're not just learning about roads, you're learning about the power of organization and collective effort, about what humans can achieve when they work together toward a common goal. When you hear that Quechua is still spoken by millions, that quinoa feeds the world, that the terraces still grow crops, you're not hearing about a dead civilization. You're hearing about a living legacy. The Inca Empire lasted less than a century as a major power. From Pachacuti's rise around 1438 to the execution of Tupac Amaru in 1572 is only 134 years. That's barely longer than the United States has been a country. But in that brief time, they built something that echoes across centuries. They built roads that are still walked, buildings that still stand. They cultivated crops that changed the world. They developed technologies and social systems that scholars still study. And they created beauty that still takes our breath away. The Spanish conquered the Inca Empire, but they couldn't conquer the Inca people or their legacy. That lives on, in the stones, in the language, in the blood of their descendants, and in the imagination of anyone who has ever looked at a photograph of Machu Picchu and felt the pull of something ancient and mysterious calling across the centuries. The empire of the Inca is gone, but the children of the sun are still here, and their story is still being written. And so, our journey through the Inca Empire comes to an end. We've walked the royal roads, stood in the cloud city of Machu Picchu, and witnessed the tragic fall of a civilization that seemed destined to last forever. The Inca built an empire in less than a century that has left a mark lasting 500 years and counting. They proved that human ingenuity can overcome any obstacle, that beauty and utility can coexist, and that even when an empire falls, the culture that created it can endure. Thank you for traveling back in time with me tonight. If you enjoyed this journey, I'd be grateful if you'd like the video and subscribe to the channel. And I'd love to know, have you ever visited Machu Picchu? Is it on your list of places to see? Let me know in the comments. The stones of the Inca still stand in the Andes, waiting. They've survived earthquakes and centuries. They'll survive centuries more. And they'll still be there, silent and magnificent, ready to tell their story to anyone willing to listen and to wonder. Until our next journey into history, sleep well, dream of mountains and ancient cities, and remember that the past is never really gone. It lives on in stones, in stories, and in us. Good night.